Hello, Old Testament scholars. Welcome back to Old Testament Interpretation 1. Today we're going to be talking about the primeval history. This is the block of literature associated with Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Now, I just have to say, I usually, the way I teach, I have a conversation. I just ask a bunch of questions and play off of the things that people respond to. And we often do exercises when I'm in person where I ask a question, give you time to reflect and write and so on. The structure of this kind of class makes that a bit more difficult. And I'm sorry about that, but I will give you a chance to kind of take a break, reflect on a big question, and talk about it a bit. But I'll have to do some more synthetic work just by talking. But in the discussion forums, feel free to continue the conversations and ask more questions. That Ask Anything forum is a great place to kind of continue questions. There have already been some great ones, big, important questions asked, and I've tried to start some theological conversations there so we can always extend that. But we will also have time to address particular issues in our scripture reading practicum, which is an optional thing, but feel free to join it. And we'll record at least one of those a week and give you access to it so you can join in and see those conversations even if you can't take part in person. So in any event, let me open us in prayer. This is a prayer that's written by Walter Brueggemann, who is an Old Testament professor here at Columbia Theological Seminary for many years. And this is a prayer that he wrote that he would pray when teaching about Genesis. So let us pray. Light from light. Creation from chaos, life from death, joy from sorrow, hope from despair, peace from hate. All your gifts, all your love, all your power, all from your word, fresh from your word, all gifts of your speech. We give you thanks for your world-forming speech. Thanks as well for our speech back to you, the speech of mothers and fathers who dared to speak in faith and unfaith, in trust and in distrust, in grateful memory and in high hurt. We cherish their speech as we trust yours. Listen this day for the groans and yearnings of your world. Listen to our songs of joy and our own dirges of death. And in the midst of our stammering, speak your clear word of life. In the name of your word, come flesh. Amen. So, as I said, we're focusing on Genesis chapters 1 through 11 today. That is a group, like kind of a subgrouping of the book of Genesis. We'll talk a little bit more about this even during this module, about how we divide bigger texts into smaller blocks. But this is a section of the book of Genesis that scholars often call the primeval history. It's divided up this way in part because of what it addresses, the content. This is the part of the Bible that talks about the whole earth. So Genesis 1 through 11 are actually quite different from Genesis 12 through 50 even. If you remember the story in Genesis 12, Abram and Sarah are chosen to leave from the house of the father, their family's kind of world that they inhabit, and they are asked by God to go visit someplace that they don't even know where it is yet. So to step out on a journey. That begins basically the second part of the Bible. You know, a lot of people divide the Bible into Old Testament and New Testament. I think it makes a lot more sense to divide the Bible into two parts, Genesis 1 through 11 and then Genesis 12 all the way through to the end of Revelation. The reason is that in Genesis 1 through 11, God creates the world and then encounters a series of problems and tries to fix these problems by doing something to the whole world at once, whether it's just two people, Adam and Eve, or whether it's a whole bunch of people, like in the Tower of Babel story. God is trying to fix the world all at the same time by direct intervention. And this proves to be unhelpful. It doesn't work. The flood doesn't work in the sense that it doesn't change people and make them all good. The Tower of Babel, fixing that situation, however we want to interpret that story, doesn't fix the world. There are still these problems. Genesis 12 seems to suggest that God changes the way that God works with the world. It's like a change in plan. And God chooses one small family to work with very carefully over a long period of time instead of trying to, fix the whole world all at once. And that is the story. The story that follows that small family is the story that ends up eventuating in Jesus. And then in the New Testament, other peoples from around the world are asked to join that family. That's the way that Paul puts it, that Gentiles through Jesus can be grafted into the tree of Israel. So all to say, Genesis 1 through 11 is quite different from the rest of the Old Testament and New Testament. This is why scholars have pointed out that it's a bit unusual and should be taken a bit differently. But also the kinds of stories that we encounter there are quite unique. So if you think about Genesis 1 through 11, we have some pretty interesting storylines, right, involving very ancient people who aren't yet Israelite, who aren't yet part of the family of Abram and Sarah, who aren't easily identifiable in terms of time and place. When does the Garden of Eden occur? It's very unclear according to Genesis, but also you have some what people see as elements that seem to be from a different time and place that doesn't correspond to our reality. So people live extraordinarily long lifespans. People are talking to snakes, right? So there are some parts of these stories, or in the Babel story, all the world is living in one place and speaks one language. These seem to be from a different time and place that doesn't accord with the world as we know it, but also seems to kind of explain some parts of the world that we understand and explain how they came to be. So you can imagine the Tower of Babel story as the answer to the question, why are there so many languages around the world? So in any event, I'll just say that this, it kind of explains how the world came to be, but also explains a different world that we don't have access to anymore. This is why the word primeval is used. This means kind of very ancient, before time, even before history, right? Before the world as we know it existed. That's what primeval means, before some sort of major event. This is why we divide Genesis 1 through 11 instead of 1 through 12, or 1 through 15 or something, right? We're looking for breaks in both the style of the literature, the kinds of stories that we see and the kinds of literature that we see, but also a change in the content, what the stories talk about. We'll talk more about that style and content as we move along during this module. Okay, by the way, your covenant, that is everyone who is not part of the family of Abram and Sarah, which includes me. I'm Irish and Croatian, so I'm a Gentile. But my covenant, and I'm guessing yours, is found in Genesis 1 through 11 as well. Did you see it? Did you find it? Well, we'll talk about it later if you didn't. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the world behind the text and also the world in the text today. That is, we're going to talk about the history kind of behind the text that informed the text and give you some tools to talk about the world behind the text in some more specific ways, and talk about comparing the biblical text to other ancient texts in more specific ways. But then we'll also talk a little bit about the world in the text, and we'll focus on structure. Like Genesis 1 through 11 is a piece of the literature, so I'll talk a little bit about how we divide the text into pieces, but also how we understand texts to be structured. And then we'll talk a little bit about style, about biblical narrative style, and what we can learn from paying attention to the style very carefully. So we'll start with this world behind the text. So the setting, as I pointed out last week, is this area of the ancient Near East, or ancient Southwest Asia and Northeast Africa, however we want to talk about this, but this very particular cultural setting, which shared a cultural reservoir of religious ideas and literature and song, in which there were thick and rich and deep interconnections and sharings between all of these cultures. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we read the biblical text. So in this very specific time and place, in a very specific culture, in a very specific linguistic environment, I have a claim, and that's a theological claim, by the way. So you don't have to agree with this. I'm just going to tell you how I understand the Bible. I'll show some of my cards here. I try not to often tell you what you have to believe, simply because you might believe differently than me, and that's a good thing. I think God works through diversity, not just in identity, but also in what we believe and how we work. I don't think we need to have an absolute consistency of what we think about the Bible. But I'll tell you one of my foundational claims right here, and that's that God is an incarnational God. This is kind of a metaphor, really, but that God speaks to people in particular times and places in ways that they can understand. That is, that God communicates to people in ways that they can understand. A correlate, sort of another belief that's tied to this one, a corollary to this, is that God is speaking to people, and that people are in some way formed and shaped by their cultural setting. I don't exist outside of my cultural space and context, and in the same way, I don't think ancient Israelites did too. So if God wanted to communicate with ancient Israelites, and if ancient Israelites were thoroughly a part of their cultural context, if Abram and Sarah were actually people who actually came from Mesopotamia, who believed Mesopotamian things, of course they would, because they were Mesopotamian people. They were called from Ur, down over here. They were from Mesopotamia. They ended up in Haran, up here, which is also Mesopotamia. And they're being called to Canaan, which is another very particular place, but that shares in this cultural matrix of the ancient world. So all to say that if God wants to speak to these folk, God is going to have to speak in a language they can understand. And God can't say things that are beyond their understanding. Or if God does, then they're just going to miss it, right? It won't be an actual communication or conversation. So if God wants to explain the beginning of the world to these folks, God can't use modern science. God has to speak in ways that they understand, and the conventions of their world that they understand. And through that, God can change them and push them into new understandings of theology and philosophy and history and different ethical ways of understanding the world. But God has to start somewhere, and that starting has to start with who they are and where they are in the world that they live in. So all to say, ancient Israelites were not terribly different than the peoples that surrounded them. They were an ancient Near Eastern people. They fit within that cultural milieu. They're latecomers on the scene, right? But they borrow from these cultures to express their own ideas, and they don't even think of it as borrowing, right? In the same way that I don't think of myself as borrowing from the culture around me. I'm just talking. I'm just using words. But these are words that someone else has used, right? Many others have used before me. And when I say something that I think is new, it's often not. So, in any event, in this cultural matrix, there's if we're thinking about Israelite literature as a product of this ancient context, there's a tool that we can use that is really helpful for us to understand literature, and that is the tool of genre. Now, most people don't think about a genre when they're writing something or reading something or hearing something or watching something, but it's a kind of an unconscious or subconscious category that is always active in everything that we do and everything that we say. So what do I mean by genre? A genre is a category of artistic production. A category of production. It means, like, what kind of thing is this? So genres are categories that we have a basic idea of, that we use to identify things so that we can then understand them and engage them. So if I start watching a movie and I see that people are laughing and falling down and, funny things are happening, but sometimes scary things, I'm supposed to laugh, right? Someone falls off a building in something that I recognize as a comedy, I'm not going to be so scared. But if they fall off a building in a horror suspense movie, that's a different genre, a different category, I might feel differently towards it, right? So I recognize a type of story, a type of song, a type of movie, and then I get some expectations that it rises up in me that go along with it. One great example of this is Once Upon a Time. If I tell you Once Upon a Time, you start to get all sorts of ideas in your head, right? You start to think, okay, this is a fairy tale, and then you get a kind of setting in your mind, like an ideal setting, right? So this is like a parent talking to a child, telling them a story that's fantastical, that should have some kind of happy ending, right? Or some moral to it, and so on. So you're kind of hearing that story, and if you hear a fairy tale, you probably wouldn't ask, how old are the main characters, and where do they go to school, and what do they do for work, what's their job, or what year did this happen, right? When you hear Little Red Riding Hood, you don't think, what year did this happen, what was Red Riding Hood's last name, is that really her name, what's on her birth certificate? We don't ask these kinds of questions because it's a fairy tale, right? We know to engage it in certain ways and not others. So in that same way, a genre is a category of cultural production that raises up certain kinds of questions for us and leads us to engage with it in certain ways. And if we don't get the genre, then we often don't understand how to engage the text or movie or something else in a productive way. When I mean productive, what I mean is in a way that leads us to further insights and understanding. So just think about this, right? So think about your expectations and think about what kind of genre this would be. I'm going to read a quote here, okay? With appealing cultural and culinary schemes and a beautiful colonial core of lovely tree-shaded streets, Oaxaca is one of Mexico's most captivating cities. Artists and artisans alike are inspired by the area's creative atmosphere, its indigenous traditions, and bright, clear light. Oaxaca has top-class museums, inns, fascinating markets, and its own subtle version of Mexican cuisine. So if I read that to someone thousands of years ago, not only would they not know what Oaxaca was, because it wasn't founded yet, but they wouldn't get this. So all to say, genres are culturally bound. They are culturally constrained, and it's possible to misunderstand them. And we often don't just get ancient genres. There was a different culture. But you probably know enough about modern literature to know what that was that I just read. With appealing cultural and culinary schemes and a beautiful colonial core of lovely tree-shaded streets, Oaxaca is one of Mexico's most captivating cities, right? What kind of genre, where would you encounter that kind of literature? It's a tour guide, right? That's someone trying to sell you something. So when you read a tour guide, you know one thing, and that's that someone's trying to encourage you to enjoy a vacation or something, right? Probably. Or maybe it's a trip for work that someone's taking, that they buy a tour guide or something. But also, what are they showing you? They're showing you, that they're trying to explain to you that you can enjoy this food and these indigenous traditions and so on, and the clear light and so on. This is meant for tourists. And by the way, this is a photo's guide that I'm reading here, so it's probably designed for American or European tourists. It's Anglo-centric or European-centric, right? It's meant for white people generally who are traveling, and other folks who engage these texts will have to kind of read them with that light, right? In that light, and maybe read against the grain in certain ways, or the mentioning of indigenous traditions. I can consume indigenous traditions in Oaxaca if I go there, right? As a white person, but all to say that this genre is constructing a particular audience. It's imagining a particular audience. And if I understand that audience, I can both understand more of the text, and I can, in some ways, read against the grain, right? I can understand who's not mentioned in the text, or who's left out of this text, or what the text is kind of trying to do that it may not even understand it's trying to do. What is this text not going to tell you about, right? Well, it may not tell you that there were a bunch of anti-American riots in Oaxaca about 10 years ago or so, and there were American tourists who were killed there, right? In part, they probably don't want to scare tourists off from Oaxaca, or they want to make sure you have a good time there. They don't want to burden you with anxiety there, and so on. By the way, the reason that there were riots in Oaxaca was a labor movement that was fed up with oppressive labor practices and so on. That's probably not going to be mentioned in the tour guide for American tourists, right? So all to say, when we understand a genre, we understand the implied situation, which involves a speaker and an audience, and we can kind of get a sense of what this text is. We can then put it in a category, tour guide or travel guide, that will help us to understand that text better. So how do we know that there's something like a travel guide? How did you know that? It was because you've read them before, because you've encountered them before. If you've never encountered a travel guide before, this might be perplexing to you. So when we introduce you to ancient genres of texts, and that's what we're doing with trying to get you to read Hidden Riches, these stories and poems and things are going to be confusing at first because you're not familiar with the genre. You're not familiar with this type of literature. It may benefit you to read the second half of the chapters in Hidden Riches before the first. If you start reading the ancient texts and you're like, I don't get what this is at all, there's always a part afterwards where Chris Hayes, in the discussion part, you can see it says discussion right there, right? Starting with the discussion, Chris Hayes will give some background information and explain these genres, these types of literature, and try to explain some of the comparisons to the biblical texts that we're more familiar with. So that might be a reading strategy to help you kind of understand that. But let me give you one more modern example of genre, just to kind of give us another chance to engage this idea. So what is this? What is this genre? I mean, I'm just showing you one still image, but you probably know that this comes from a movie. And this movie, or series of movies, they're often called spaghetti westerns. Spaghetti used because they were filmed in Italy, because it was cheaper than filming in California for a bunch of these western movies. So this is actually Italy in the Italian hills here. But when I show you this image, you probably have like a feeling, right? You probably get a feeling here, and maybe it's a feeling of like revulsion or anger, right? But this is a Western, right? And that word used to capture this genre of film and literature and so on. And what do you expect, or kind of not expect, from this story, right? I mean, you can kind of think of it that when you see a Western, right? You're thinking, okay, this is maybe an anti-hero, like a guy who's good but also kind of bad, right? And I mean, if you think about Westerns, they often play with the idea of law and order, which of course is a hot topic right now, very loaded bunch of terms. But they play with the idea of expectations of order and law in places where those expectations might not be met. Places that are on the frontier, or they're disorganized, right? There's chaos. So if you think about Westerns, they are constructed from the perspective of white Anglo people, generally from the perspective of men who are kind of going out and venturing into spaces that they see as disorganized and chaotic, where they have to assert order, sometimes through doing the wrong thing, right? It's kind of a heroic or anti-heroic. Anti-hero meaning someone who doesn't always make ethical choices, but is nevertheless the hero of a story. You can think about, like, there's often issues of differing between good and bad, trying to figure out what's good and what's bad out here in the unorganized spaces and so on. Often there's a shootout, right? Often there's death is a big a theme. What is life? What is death? Are big themes in these in these stories. But also try to think about watching a Western from the perspective of an indigenous person, right? A Native American. Somebody watching this movie might say, well, that wasn't a disorganized space to us before the settlers moved in, right? Or we had a good sense of law and order, of like our traditions and our practices and tribal practices before these folks showed up, right? And they are the ones that disorganized things and then reorganized it in a disordered way. So all to say that genre is, expects a world unto itself, but we can also ask questions about what that genre expects of us, and sometimes how it kind of influences subtly what we think. But genre isn't always bad. I've got kind of two negative examples here, but there are times where genre helps us to kind of clarifying genre helps us to focus on what might be of importance to the author. So Think about like Psalms, right? A praise psalm. If you ask lots of questions about a praise psalm, they're like, well, shouldn't you be sad right now or something? I mean, the author might say, well, I'm not. I mean, I'm praising here. Like, so there are certain kinds of questions that I think are very productive for certain kinds of genres, and other kinds of questions that we can't answer. So this is like the question, how old is Red Riding Hood? We don't know. Doesn't say it in the story, and no one's ever really cared, and it kind of doesn't matter, right? So all to say, when we talk about these genres, we'll pick a lot of these out in Genesis, and we'll continue to point them out throughout our time in the Old Testament course. We'll often be referring to other ancient genres, other ancient stories that tell us more about these expectations that these stories had. So, for example, Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, right, these creation stories that we've encountered, they don't ask questions about science. That's a different genre of literature, which leads to different questions, different concerns, and so on. So if we clarify our genre, Genesis 1 is a poem or a liturgy or something. It's going to lead us to different types of concerns. And it's going to, I think, help us to engage the literature more clearly. So, this picture right here, this image that I'm showing you, this is normal to an ancient Near Eastern person. You may look at this and say, I don't get what that is at all. What's happening there, right? Well, what's happening there is a hero who has a big beard, right? A big beard, which symbolizes kind of ancient Mesopotamian facial practices. This Mesopotamian person is standing on a giant bull and is kind of fighting it and bending it. This is probably Gilgamesh. Wrestling the bull of heaven, which is a part of the Gilgamesh story. If an ancient person saw this, even a person in ancient Canaan or ancient Israel, they probably would have gotten it. People around the ancient world knew the story of Gilgamesh. They got it. They understood what kind of literature it was, and they knew what to expect when they encountered it. We don't, but now maybe you do. That is, Professor Hayes gives us some insights into this. So we might ask, what was Gilgamesh used for? What was its setting? Who said this kind of stuff, and where did they say it? So we can say it's epic poetry, right? Or it's a kind of poetry that was used probably to entertain, but also to make people ask big questions, to explore big questions about life, and about death, and about immortality, and so on. What's the point of this story of Gilgamesh, right? I mean, probably there's a bunch of different things that people thought of as points, but the large part of the story is kind of about who we are as humans, about our human impulses and concerns, egotism and pride, sex, kind of craving for things and desire, immortality, family is a concern in Gilgamesh, how to enjoy things. These are all concerns that you may think are modern, but in fact they're the most ancient of people had a lot of questions about these very things. So Gilgamesh is trying to get us to ask these questions about the world. There are lots of other ancient texts we can also look at to help us think about the primeval history, but just to recognize that Gilgamesh is set in this kind of distant ancient past, in which people acted differently, lived longer lives, could do amazing things that people today can't do. It's a primeval history. It talks about a flood, right? Gilgamesh meets this guy who lived before the flood in kind of this other realm. And we hear about this kind of time before time where humans and gods could talk to one another very easily. And it's assumed that kind of in the world of the readers of Gilgamesh that those are distant times. So we can see that there's some similarities here. There are other ancient Near Eastern flood stories too that Chris Hayes talks about in his book. We can also say that there's other ancient stories about very ancient kings that lived a very long time before a flood and so on. So this pre-flood time is a big idea in the ancient Near East. Egypt has an idea about this kind of very distant past. Mesopotamia, the various Mesopotamian traditions have ideas about this ancient past. Canaan has ideas about these ancient pasts that existed before some sort of big change in which the world turned into what it is now that we're all familiar with. And the more that we understand about these, the more that we can understand what is Genesis 1 through 11 trying to do, right? And that's what we call the comparative approach. We look at all these other texts from other cultures. We try to compare it to the Bible so that we can understand the Bible better. Also, Gilgamesh, as Professor Hayes points out, shows us a lot about the composition history and the history of the editing or redaction, the history of the editing of ancient texts, and the kind of the attribution to certain heroic and sometimes symbolic authors. So Gilgamesh ends up 1,000 years after it's first begins to be written down in parts and then kind of edited together. I mean, Gilgamesh is a bunch of different stories at first that get eventually worked together, and then they get kind of improved and changed over time in different ways by different communities. And eventually, there's this one version that becomes kind of standard throughout the Mesopotamian world, and it's associated then with a scribe that no one ever knows to have existed. It's just a name given to the scribe. So there's kind of attribution of symbolic authorship to something that's really the production of lots of different voices throughout a long period of time. And that's kind of what we're talking about with redaction criticism and source criticism with the Old Testament. That is, there's lots of different versions of biblical stories that eventually got edited together. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. We might think that makes the Bible wrong, or it makes it kind of break copyright code or something. You know, we think of it in modern terms with authors, right? If I say I wrote something and I didn't, that's plagiarism. In the ancient world, they didn't have those same categories. So when we talk about the book of Genesis, it does help us to think about the very different genres that we encounter and the different voices that we encounter, and try to separate those out a bit so that we can take them on their own terms, and then think about how they all come together to form something like a book of Genesis. And I think we have a much richer understanding of what God is doing through this text if we can see those different voices and understand them in their own contexts. So here's a little there we go. I'm going to move my face over here. This is a little kind of summary of various similarities and differences between Gilgamesh and Genesis 6 through 9, the flood story with Noah. Now, you all read the flood story. You read Gilgamesh. You also read Chris Hayes' book, his part about the flood stories. So you've already read this, but just to point this out, right? There's lots of similarities between the Noah story and Gilgamesh. And the Noah story had to have been written down sometime after the year 1200 or so BCE. That's about when people would date Moses to. But also there was no Hebrew language written before that point because the alphabet wasn't really used before that point. So, in other words, that's kind of our beginning. But Gilgamesh had been written down for many years before that. We have examples of Sumerian flood stories that exist 2,000 years before any of Genesis was written down. So Genesis comes much later than this kind of ancient Mesopotamian flood story and borrows from it in order to express something about God and about the world that I think is true. But we do need to understand that an ancient flood story is a genre, and that ancient Israelites were familiar with this genre. They knew what to expect here. And you can see all these similarities between what happens in the Genesis story of Noah and then what happens in Gilgamesh. But there are some differences. And did you notice these, right? So if we were in class, I would ask you, what are the differences? Give you a moment to think and write, and then talk to each other, and then talk to the class. But we're online. So what I'm going to do here is just ask you to reflect for a moment. Maybe you can pause this video and just think for a moment about what some of the similarities and differences are. Okay, so we've reflected. Great. If you this chart actually shows you the main similarities and differences, right? The one thing that's not in the Gilgamesh story is a good reason for the flood. We do find other ancient poems which tell us some of the reasons for the flood, but they generally involve humans making noise or being too loud and things like this, getting on the nerves of the gods. It doesn't really have to do with morality. It just has to, even the explanations are a bit strange, and they kind of stretch credulity, right? There's no good reason for the flood in the story of Gilgamesh or the story of Atrahasis, these other ancient flood stories. In Genesis, we have reason for the flood that is also a bit strange, right? If you read Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, you see the whole myth of the angels and the humans. When I say myth, I don't mean that in a negative sense. I just mean it's a story about humans and angels in a time that before what we recognize to be the world now, right? Human-angel sexual encounters are not something that I hear people worry about very much right now. Although I did hear something in the news about someone talking about this recently. But in any event, this is in Genesis 6:5 and 6:11 through 13, we get other mentions that the world is full of violence, the whole earth is filled up with violence, and that God is mad about this, right? God wants a world that is full of peace and harmony and blessing, like fruitfulness, right? God doesn't want violence and bloodshed. So that's why God does this. It's a very different reason than you find in Gilgamesh, right? Another problem is near the end of Gilgamesh, there's this big conflict among the gods, and this is a big part of all of the ancient Near Eastern flood stories. But you don't have a conflict among the gods in Genesis, right? And why is that? Because there's only one, right? Because Genesis has a very particular perspective on God, right? There's only one of them, as opposed to the ancient Near East where there are many gods. So you can see that the authors of Genesis are borrowing some of these ideas and stories and structures of stories from their neighbors, but they are also editing them for their own particular perspective and their own particular theology. And the more we know about what they're choosing to change, the more it comes to life for us. So they're choosing to talk about how there is a reason for this flood, and that is that God abhors violence and wants peace. Now, that it may strike you that that's a bad reason to try to kill everything, right? Well, God agrees with you. So we'll get to that in a minute. And also the conflict among the gods. Something interesting about ancient Israelite literature is that a lot of the tension and kind of plot that is taken up by other ancient texts, think about like Greek literature or Egyptian literature, right? The gods fight among themselves, and we don't have that in the Bible because there's only one, right? But there is sometimes tension in the character of God, and we'll feel that tension and see it come out in the rest of our work for today. So in any event, there's a lot more to say about Gilgamesh, but I don't want to take too much time, and Professor Hayes goes into some good detail about some of the things we can learn about the Bible from this comparison to Gilgamesh. Here's, by the way, tablet 13, or tablet 11, I'm sorry, from Gilgamesh, this kind of famous flood story tablet. You can see parts of it are broken. It's parts of Gilgamesh we have to kind of get from other ancient versions of Gilgamesh. But this is the main witness to that flood story from ancient Babylon. Clay tablet that has been kind of burned and baked hard. Okay. So now when we move to the biblical text from thinking about comparisons to other ancient genres, it's good to kind of start with this kind of ancient context and like, what are these stories and what do people expect from them, right? These are stories that explain the flood stories, something that explains something about how the world came to be. There are lots of other differences we can say too, like at the end of the Noah story, Noah sacrifices, but God doesn't like buzz around, right? In the Gilgamesh and Atrahasis stories, the gods are like buzzing around like flies because they need the person to sacrifice, right? They need humans to sacrifice in order to eat food. Yahweh doesn't need that. The God of Israel doesn't need people. Yahweh doesn't buzz around like flies around the sacrifice of Noah. God just smells it and says, thanks Noah. It's like Noah is symbolically sacrificing to Yahweh. So this is a big difference too. That in the ancient world they felt like they needed people. The gods need people to be their servants or slaves. But that's actually something that's missing in the biblical text. So another one of these key differences. And there's more that you can explore and try to think about yourself as well. So, but then the next step for us as biblical scholars is to then think about the complexity of the biblical text, not just the complexity of the ancient genre and the ancient context, but the text itself. So we think about source criticism, which Professor Yoder has very helpfully explained in her module about the Pentateuchal criticism and the documentary hypothesis. So now we know about J and P and so on. Here's, by the way, the first 4 books of the Bible. This is the Pentateuch or the Torah minus Deuteronomy. Why is Deuteronomy not here? Because it's all D. It's all the Deuteronomistic source. But you can see the complexity of Genesis through Numbers. You can also see some books like Leviticus are almost all P or priestly source. You can see that Genesis and Exodus and Numbers are very segmented, and Genesis is the most segmented of all of these between the Yahwist, the Elohist, and the priestly source, and so on. And then redactors, these people who tie texts together, and who gave us the Bible as we have it today. So the world behind the text then is not just about a comparative work with other cultures, but we also want to ask about the history of how this text came to be, right? How did this text come to exist? And we now know that Genesis 1 through 11 is comprised of many different stories from at least 2 or 3 different hands that have been edited together, and that we can see this diversity within the text. There's theological diversity within this text. There's sociological diversity. Priestly people are different from the Yahwists. The Yahwists seem to be related to the royal court, and the priestly folks are in the priestly circles. They work for different bosses, right? That's going to affect the way that they write and the way that they understand their stories. And then the redactors, we think that those folks were in a different context as well, a later context where they're trying to knit together and attach together the stories of ancient Israel in all their differences. I should say right here that in comparative work, we can say that the Bible is unlike any other ancient text. So it's like lots of ancient texts, like there's the flood story and so on, but what's unusual about the Bible when you compare it to the Gilgamesh story is that when editors throughout history in the Mesopotamian context edited Gilgamesh, they would take parts out and they would add parts to contextualize it for their own time and place and audience. They would edit things, they would take out lines, they would add lines. One thing they never did was combine 2 versions of the same story into something that was confusing. They never did that. You can't find that anywhere else in the ancient world, that someone took 2 versions of an ancient story and interwove them. But that's something we find all the time in the Bible. Think about the Noah story, for one. Think about the repetitions of the sister-wife stories that we find in the matriarchs and patriarchs, right? All those times that both times that Abram and then the time that Isaac both try to pass off their wife as their sister. Those stories are all kind of related to one another, but why were they all preserved? Or the 2 different covenants that Abram has with God in Genesis 15 and Genesis 17. It's kind of awkward to have 2 covenants. These seem to be 2 different traditions that somebody preserved by putting them together. And why do this? No other ancient culture does this. Instead, when they edit something, they take out the old parts and they make it work perfectly. I mean, they make it smooth, right? But you have in the Noah story, in Genesis 6 through 9, Noah's bringing on 7 kinds of animals one time, and he's bringing on 2 by 2, another time. There's a contrast in terms of the characterization of God and of Noah, and there are these kind of bumps in the story that help us to untie these different traditions, and show us that they were originally 2 distinct versions of the story. But why would they preserve them like this? Maybe ancient Israelite authors and editors were terrible authors and editors. They didn't understand that these stories had bumps in them or rough edges, or that sometimes there were conflicting versions of the stories, right? Maybe. But I don't think so. I think ancient Israelite authors and editors were really smart. They were just as smart as you and I. So if I start from that premise that ancient Israelite authors were smart, they were just as smart as me and they were just as smart as you, they could understand if a story didn't make a lot of sense because they were trying to put things together, then we've got another way of thinking about it, and that is that they are trying as hard as they can to preserve all of the voices of ancient Israelite tradition that they can. This person up here, or group here, the redactors, that means editors, the people who edited together these ancient sources, they were trying as hard as they could to preserve all of the voices that they could from ancient Israelite history, and they were trying to let them speak in their own voice without smoothing them over so that they all made sense together. In other words, this person didn't want to have their voice run roughshod over all of the other voices of ancient Israel. And this is why we have a text in Genesis that's hard to read sometimes. Hard to read in the sense that it says one thing and then says something kind of different, 2 by 2 and of the clean animals there were 7, and the different dates and for things and so on. It's confusing to read Genesis and other books in the Bible precisely because there was a priority given, a value of preserving distinct voices and giving them their say instead of eradicating them. I think that's amazing. It's an amazing theological point. It's an amazing ethical point. And it's an encouragement for us to listen to these different voices and take them seriously because they see God differently. They see the world differently. And you know what? You and I might see God in the world differently too. And instead of me trying to force you to see it my way, or you trying to force me to see it your way, maybe we can learn from each other, from our different experiences, from our different understandings of the world. So that's what I see this as an invitation to. Source criticism is an invitation to hear carefully these ancient voices that are different and to value their distinct witness and to value the way that they are in tension with one another, and that theology comes from that preservation of tension often, rather than forcing things into a smooth and kind of indistinct surface. Okay. Enough of my own theology here, but we can talk a little bit about source criticism and the ways that the different sources work throughout the rest of our time here. But what I want to do is give you a chance to do a little bit of work. So there is under the little tab on Moodle for this module, it says Readings. Under Readings, there's a little bit there's one PDF that is labeled something about the Noah story, the Noah story with sources revealed, or something like that. So take a minute or 5 minutes. This video will end here, but I'm going to give you a task here. That task is to read through one of those two sources. You'll see that there's one source on one side of the page and one source on the other side. There's the P story, and then there's the J version of the story. So different biblical scholars have, using all of the clues of language and theology that we can make sense are distinct between these two versions of the story, they've pulled apart these two versions of the story, and there's the P version and the J version on that page, right? And this is not where we stop. Like we don't read the Bible with just P and J. We're going to read it together, but in order to read it together well, I think we have to take it apart first and think and try to hear these ancient sources very clearly. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Read one, either P or J. You can choose whichever one you want to choose. It doesn't really matter. I'm guessing half the class will choose P, half the class will choose J, right? But when you read this story, ask 3 questions of yourself. How is God characterized? How is Noah characterized? And what is the problem? I guess there's a fourth. It's kind of, I think of it as part of the third. What is the problem and its solution? What is the problem that's given in the text, and what is the solution that's given in the text? So when I ask about how God is characterized, I mean, just take a look at, one big difference would be like, does God speak? Does Noah speak? What do they talk about? How do they speak? But then also in that question about problems and solutions, what is the actual problem that God is trying to fix? And then at the end of the story, how does God solve this problem? Or is it solved? So take a few minutes, read one of those, and just try to take notes. Just try to notice. And when you read this, try to close your ears and eyes to the other story, right? We're so used to reading these together. Try to just blank slate your mind and try to focus on one story and give that story your full attention, and imagine that the other version of the story doesn't exist. All right, I'll see you in the next video.